think reality is much more complicated than that, especially textual reality, where so much of the tradition comes from the reading of previous texts, the rereading of previous texts.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to our Puluso Ministries, and welcome to yet another episode. And today we have a wonderful guest on our show, and his name is Professor Jon Levenson, and he's from Harvard Divinity School. And he's quite a wonderful guest, and he's very knowledgeable in the Hebrew Bible, and he's going to be helping us in today's topic on the resurrection. He has done a few books, quite a lot of books, in fact, on this subject and other subject matters that he has written about. And he's someone that I highly recommend that you pick up his work and read from him. And you can actually learn a lot. I've actually been blessed to have read some of his work, and they have come quite a little bit handy. And he's done wonderful work. And welcome, Jon, to Puluso Ministries today.
Thank you very much, Pastor Sequoia. It's a delight to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I hope I live up to it.
Yeah, I think you come very, very highly rated. I mean, I've read your books and I've been touched by a lot of your work that you have published over the years. Yeah, and our conversation will be centered around the book that you published in I think it's 2006, named Resurrection and Restoration of Israel. So basically, we'll be talking about resurrection, which is quite a big deal in the Christian faith. We could almost say that Christianity is a faith of resurrection, if we were to call it that. And we're basically going to be tracing the resurrection as it makes its sort of the first appearance in the Hebrew Bible, and what it means when it does appear in the Hebrew Bible and in early Judaism, and also trace it how it makes its way into the New Testament text. And Jon, we're going to be talking about that. Before we dive into the actual conversation, I would like you to actually give a little bit of background as to who you are and what has motivated you to become a biblical scholar and also a theologian.
Well, thank you. In college, I majored in English. My father told me that was a very good idea. He said, because you already speak it. I mean, if I'd said I was going to major in Chinese, how far would I have gotten in 4 years? From zero. So, but my love was always languages and literatures and ideas. And I thought I could combine all those with my religious commitment and my involvement in Judaism and my involvement in comparative religion and my involvement in theology more generally by concentrating in biblical studies. So in graduate school and for my doctoral work, I studied the Hebrew Bible, mostly in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world in which it emerged, and did a lot of work in comparative Semitics and that kind of thing. But I've always had this eagerness to combine critical study, intellectually honest critical study informed by modern disciplines and modern discoveries with the classical religious tradition. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? How do they respond to the critiques of each other? How is it possible to be a seriously committed religious person in the modern world? That's always been in the background and sometimes in the foreground of the type of work I've been trying to do. So when I wrote about resurrection, well, this is a theme, what the rabbis call tchiat hametim, the resurrection of the dead, is a very important theme in the Jewish tradition, largely ignored, I think, by most contemporary Jews. And I thought it would be a useful thing to explore just what this thing meant in antiquity, where it came from, and how it differs from other ideas that people have, like immortality of the dead and so forth.
Okay, great. That's a very good sort of descriptive introduction of who you are and what has informed your work over the years. And I was intrigued by the title of your book. You name it The Resurrection and Restoration of Israel. What sort of inspired you to sort of coin that title?
Because I think the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, the end time general resurrection of the dead, when it appears at some point in Second Temple Judaism, having a long prehistory, but some point 3rd, 2nd century BCE, you see it emerging clearly, derives from oracles of the restoration of a downtrodden people, Israel, of a downtrodden Jewish people, defeated, losing national sovereignty or having a very precious and fragile national sovereignty. This notion of a vision of an end time in which they are renewed and repopulated and reclaim their land and their dynasty and their temple. All this, I think, is the framework in which the resurrection of the dead as a general doctrine of the end times comes to be. I don't think one can simply talk about resurrection in terms of individuals, disconnected, deracinated individuals coming back to life. It's in the nature of a national oracle, an oracle to this special people that God, for his own mysterious reasons, formed for himself according to the biblical narrative. And the notion of the renewed life of the individuals is a function of this renewed, this fulfilled promise to the people of Israel. The restoration of Israel and the resurrection of the dead are really very much go hand in hand. I mean, I think, for example, of the famous vision of the dry bones that Ezekiel has in Ezekiel 37.
Yes.
It's sponsored a great much preaching and song and so on, a very influential text. Well, that's actually a vision of the people Israel coming out of their graves to undergo what I call a new exodus, Israel's exodus from the grave, but at the same time an exodus from exile into the promised land. And the book of Ezekiel, just a few chapters later, closes with 9 chapters of a vision of the renewed, restored Israel, the renewed, restored temple, renewed, restored priesthood. So I think these things can't really be separated. The great modern temptation is to take resurrection and say, well, it applies to me, applies to an individual disconnected from a larger body. And that's what I was trying to combat with the title Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel.
So what you're getting at is more of a corporate sort of resurrection versus an individual kind of resurrection. That's what I connect.
That's correct. I think that's well put. It's a corporate event. This is how it's described in the Bible. Whether one believes it or disbelieves it is a separate question. But how is it actually described? It's described as an end-time reversal of the natural course of things. Because the natural course of things is our lives give out and we die. The natural course of things is that nations have their moment of glory, it may last centuries, and then they die. But here, there's a prediction of a radical reversal of that, a reversal of nature, a miraculous event in which the nation rises. Now, it's not necessarily that everybody is resurrected into some glorious, deathless existence, as it's described in Daniel 12 and elsewhere. There's an element of judgment involved. Most moderns, most contemporaries don't want to hear the element of judgment. They want to say, well, I have eternal life. And, oh, I will. That's fantastic. Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. This depends on God's judgment at the end time. So the notion of God eschatologically in the end time, establishing justice finally, after a long history of injustice, and fulfilling his promises to the people of Israel after a long history in which those promises have been derailed numerous times. That's very much of a piece with this vision of resurrection.
Okay, and John, could you sort of help me out and also our audience out in terms of distinguishing between the resurrection of the dead and also the immortality of the soul? What is the difference between the two?
That's an extremely important question. Thank you for asking it. Well, the immortality of the soul, as I understand it, means we all have some indestructible core, some invisible, indestructible core in ourselves, which no one can see. It's not physical, but it survives death. So it's independent of the body in the sense that when the body dies, the most important thing, which is the soul, lives on. This is generally how things are viewed among those who believe in immortality in the Greek and Roman worlds. And this is what a lot of people think of as resurrection today, but that's really not resurrection. In the case of resurrection, death is real. It's not that you only appear to die or you just shuffle off your mortal coil, which is irrelevant to the real you. The real you is not your arthritic knee or your bad teeth. The real you is the soul. Here, the real you in resurrection dies. Death is real. It's a grievous thing. It's not an illusion. But then God will, in the vision of resurrection, at some point perform a miracle. It's scientifically quite impossible. A miracle that involves the reconstitution of the dead person, the reanimation of a corpse, to put it crudely, the reanimation of corpses and the restoration of them into life, which would be a completely different life from what we have now. It would be a life with no death at the end of it, no second death, a deathless life. You see this described in a lot of the literature of ancient Judaism. You also see it described in the New Testament and so forth. Very hard to imagine what that body is like that rises and is not susceptible to the decay and disease and death that we all face. But that's the vision. So in other words, I think a lot of modern people prefer immortality to resurrection for a very simple and understandable reason. Immortality does not involve a miracle. It just says we naturally are constituted with something. You can call it the soul, the self, consciousness, something that survives the physical substrate that makes it possible. Whereas, notice, as I just defined immortality, you didn't hear anything at all about God. The word God never crossed my lips. But, rather like the evil people in the book of Psalms. But in the vision of resurrection, God intervenes into nature to work this miraculous event, this miracle that involves the reanimation of people who really are dead. And so in modern times, if you're skeptical of miracles, you're skeptical of an intervening God, you'd rather have a distant God who created the world and set it off on its own and has nothing to do with it ever since, or no God at all, then you'll be much happier with immortality than with resurrection. Of course, many people don't believe in either.
Okay, I think that's quite profound, John. What I'm picking out from you as to what you're saying is this whole notion of the corporate identity that we find in the Hebrew Bible itself. But then my question is, in terms of the point that you're trying to drive, what is the relevance of it to God's promises and to the resurrection itself?
Well, you see, the identity, I think, in the Hebrew Bible, probably generally in the ancient Near East, identity is nothing like the modern individualistic identity that we have, at least in the modern West. I won't claim to speak about South Africa, but in the United States, there's a strong tendency towards individualism, including by religious beliefs and religious communities. I think the self in ancient Israel was thought of as embedded in a family.
Okay.
One's lineage backwards and one's descendants, one's progeny, help define who one is. The self is not a discrete unit separated from familial relations. So the self is embedded in the family, in the tribe, in the nation. And that's how you can have a kind of fluidity in biblical narrative between individuals and their biographies and the nation and the national destiny. You know, when Jacob went down to Egypt, well, that refers to one man. Jacob goes down to Egypt. Yes, that happens in Genesis 46. But the people, Israel, and all of Jacob's descendants went down to Egypt as well, and as the narrative would have it. Is Jacob an individual, or is Jacob the whole nation? Jacob, or Israel, is the name of an individual. It's also a name of the whole nation. Shechem in Genesis 37, the man who commits a sexual outrage against Dinah in Genesis 37 is a man. He's also a town, right? Gilead is another person who is an individual. We can say his lineage, but Gilead is also a region. It's probably a familial group and a region and an individual. There's a kind of fluidity there.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think I get you, because you're making this, connection between the individualism, which didn't quite exist, but they always saw it more in type of a corporate kind of identity, which you sort of mentioned earlier on. But now,
right. It does. In the modern West, at least, I
yeah,
think people tend to perceive identity in kind of a consumer choice model. In other words, I am the master of my identity. I'm the master of myself, and I can choose whatever identity I want, rather like a consumer trying to decide which product he or she is going to buy. Whereas I think they thought of people as more naturally embedded in their familial stories, their regional stories, their tribal, their national stories. And there's a fluidity between the individual and the nation that I think is key to understanding phenomena like the resurrection of the dead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, John, you hear it in modern days sort of discussion. People will say, well, some Jews say that, they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Is there something like that?
Yeah, I think you have to realize in modern times, a very large number of Jews, the majority of Jews, are in fact secular in the sense that they don't know much about and don't subscribe very much to the classical Jewish theology. There are, of course, exceptions. There are large communities of traditional or even intensely traditional Jews who profess to believe very deeply and to practice very deeply those classical religious traditions. Most Jews today are not, unfortunately, are secular. And I think many Jews hear the word resurrection in English, and they think of Christianity because it's something you mentioned early in our discussion, that Christianity is, in a sense, a resurrection faith. It's based on the conviction that Jesus rose from the dead. So when a lot of Jews hear the term resurrection, they think, well, we don't believe that. That has to do with the whole New Testament story. But the term has somewhat different meaning in Judaism. It refers again to this eschatological event, this event at the end time, a general resurrection of the dead, which becomes a key point of Rabbinic Judaism, the ancestor of all modern forms of Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism actually makes Techiyat HaMetim, they call it the reanimation of the dead, into a central defining doctrine. And to some degree, acceptance of it was key to one's proper membership in the community as people came to perceive these things. And so this affirmation that God is Mechaye Metim, he's a person who is a God who brings about this miracle, that's affirmed in the classical liturgy multiple times a day. But a lot of Jews don't know that because they're secular, or in the case of some versions of liberal Judaism, of non-Orthodox Judaism, starting in the 19th century, there was this embarrassment at the idea of an active, personal, intervening God, and embarrassment at the whole idea of miracles. And the preference was for something different. The preference was, maybe we can say, not God brings about the life for the dead, but he keeps all of us alive. God sustains life. We could change the liturgy in such a way as to take away that offense that comes from the idea of a miraculous intervention by a supernatural personal God. And so a lot of Jewish liturgy outside of Orthodox Judaism over the decades has tended to have circumlocution so as not actually to be affirming the resurrection of the dead. So that's why a lot of Jews say, I think erroneously, that Judaism has no belief in the resurrection of the dead. If that's true, that's certain groups within Judaism in modern times who have reformulated the tradition so as to get rid of what they see as an offensive doctrine. But classical Judaism, the Judaism of Talmud and Midrash, certainly had the resurrection of the dead and even defined that as one of their key markers.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, hulusoministries.co.za.
Okay, you mentioned Rabbinic Judaism. I know many of our audience may not necessarily understand what you mean by the term Rabbinic Judaism. Can you sort of flesh it out in like a few lines just to say what it is in essence?
I can try. It's not easy. I mean, I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
But I would say, as the Jewish tradition developed in, let's say, the Roman period in Babylonia, in what in the West would be called the Roman period, there emerged the notion that there are two Torahs, two fundamental corpora of instruction. One is a written Torah, Torah shebechtav, a written Torah, which is the scripture, primarily focusing on the Pentateuch. But also that there's another Torah Sheba'al Peh, an oral Torah, which is a tradition handed down by authoritative elders, authoritative authorities, I guess all authorities are authoritative, from master to disciple, and was learned in not from books, but from recitation, memorization. And gradually that literature came to be written down itself, so it became a kind of written Torah of its own, but it's always called the oral Torah. And it takes shape in the Mishnah, which is a Jewish law code, rabbinic law code from around the year 200, 220 of the Common Era, put together in the land of Israel under Roman rule. Later on in two Talmuds, a Talmud of the land of Israel in the 5th century, a Talmud from Babylonia in the 6th century, recording traditions that go back hundreds of years. They may go back into, I don't know, 2nd, 3rd century BCE or even earlier. And they claim, ultimately, the claims made in some literature, that these traditions you find in Talmud and in Midrash, which is traditional interpretation, rabbinic interpretation of the Bible, goes all the way back to Moses on Sinai, who receives both Torahs, receives a written and an oral Torah. So you really can't understand Judaism. I guess the bottom line is this: you really can't understand what I mean and what generally people mean by Judaism if all you do is look at the Hebrew Bible, or as Christians call it in the Christian nomenclature, the Old Testament. You really have a very hard time understanding it. And you have a hard time understanding the New Testament if you only frame it over against the Old Testament or in light of the Old Testament, because there are hundreds of years in between most of the literature of the Old Testament and the earliest literature of the New Testament. So in a sense, you need to study Second Temple Judaism and this early rabbinic material as well if you're going to be a competent New Testament scholar. So awesome. I don't know if that answers it, but
yeah, I think that's very helpful. What you've sort of fleshed out. You point out, John, that there's this generally held idea about the Hebrew Bible, which may kind of be misleading, which sort of people talk about the afterlife that they deduce from the Hebrew Bible itself, and you saying no to this, and except there are a few instances in the Hebrew Bible, like in Daniel 12 or Isaiah 26 or Isaiah 66, that has these nuances of the afterlife. But you are saying in general, this idea may be quite misleading and incomplete. And why do you say that, John?
I think that when people say, well, in the Hebrew Bible, you simply die, that's the end of your life, period. Again, I think it misses this corporate dimension, this communal, familial, tribal dimension of identity. God gives promises in the Hebrew Bible that extend beyond the lifespans of the individuals to whom he gives them. He promises the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, none of whom actually assumed ownership of the land. He promises tithes to Aaron, Aharon Kohen, Aaron the priest, really for all time, although Aaron dies. These individuals are archetypes of the nations, the corporate group that identifies with them, treasures their memories, tells their stories. So the idea that people simply die and that's the end of the story strikes me as simplistic. There are promises of life. That's why the subtitle of my book is The Ultimate Victory of the God of Life. God is very strongly on the side of life in the Bible. In a number of genres is promising life. And so there's a kind of tension in this literature between the obvious empirical fact that these people die and the fact that God's promise of life is real and overrides a death. So I think that dialectic, that dichotomy has to be looked at. I think that when you conceive of human identity as inextricably embedded in family, then the answer to death in that framework is not resurrection, it becomes resurrection. The answer to death in that framework is birth. Okay. And that's why you have these stories in which you have death at the beginning of the story, but then the story has a happy ending, the birth at the end. I think it's something like the Book of Ruth. Very short little tale, 85 verses. It starts out with famine and death and exile, and ends with plenteous harvest and return to the native land, including a patriation of an alien in the land of Israel, in Judah, and finally with birth. The very end of the book of Ruth is the birth of this baby who ends up being the ancestor of King David. So, or something like the book of Job. You can't just say, well, death is the end of it. People die. Job loses his children and loses everything except his wife in the first and second chapters. He loses health in the second chapter of the book of Job. But the end of the book of Job, he's been restored, and the book of Job now has new children born to him. We might say, well, that's not much of a restoration. The original children are still dead. He didn't get them back. But that's because we think in terms of individual identity, whereas the story is on this patriarchal figure, Job, and the well-being of his family. So in the context of a world in which birth is an antidote to death, you can't exactly say there's no functional equivalent to resurrection. Death is the end, period. That's the end of the story. Just move on. That's really not so. There are promises that are still outstanding, and there are these miraculous births and these miraculous restorations that neither Ruth nor Job is likely to have expected at the beginning, and that in fact mark those stories. I think that those stories are encapsulations or epitomes of the larger story of Israel in the Bible.
Okay. John, you when I read your book, it seems like you do not support the view that most biblical texts sort of articulate in terms of the resurrection to be the same as those that are found in post Judaism and Christianity. And what is the reason for this?
Well, I think the notion that there is a general resurrection of the dead at the end time as part of this marvelous, miraculous, dramatic inversion of reality and renewal of reality that they predict would happen at the end time. I don't think you see that much at all in the Hebrew Bible until fairly late. In other words, you have scattered a couple individual cases of people coming back from the dead, demonstrating God's power over death, which is something that the Hebrew Bible, I think, easily can insist on, that God is more powerful than death. But the notion that in general, history would come to an end with an inversion of reality, a renewal of reality, and an dramatic institution of God's justice at the end, I really don't see that. I think when prophets are talking about God's judgment and justice, it's something very much in their own time frame, and usually it doesn't involve the notion of individuals coming back to life. So I really think that the resurrection of the dead at one level is an innovation in Second Temple Judaism, as I said, maybe 3rd, 2nd century BC, something like that. On the other hand, it does build on these larger themes I've been talking about, the promises that extend beyond the lifespan of the individual to whom they're made, the birth as the antidote to death, and a number of other themes. So I don't think it's a radical break. But the earlier stages of the Hebrew Bible, I don't think you see resurrection of the dead per se. Now, when the rabbis, as I was talking before, the Talmudic rabbis are trying to justify their belief in the resurrection of the dead as a key doctrine of Judaism, of course, they have to find it in the Torah. They have to find it in the Pentateuch. So when it says, appears to say to them, Az Yeshir Moshe, then Moses and the Israelites will sing this song, Exodus 15:1.
Yeah.
They say, if you read that as will sing, which is how they read it, then when's that going to happen? Moses is dead. And to them, that's proof of the resurrection of the dead. They have a number of cases where they read verses like that. I think there's something profound that they picked up in that, namely the Exodus and the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 as having as a key role in the conception of the end time later on. I think it's theologically profound, but at the plain sense level of what we call pshat, the plain, literal, contextual sense, I don't think Exodus 15:1 is talking about the resurrection of the dead. So yes, you can read it through a hermeneutic that finds it in the Hebrew Bible, but I think in fact, as a full-blown doctrine of a general resurrection of the dead, I think it's a phenomenon of Second Temple Judaism, and it becomes essential to Rabbinic Judaism and to the Jewish tradition for thousands of years after that.
Okay, that's very interesting and fascinating what you sort of bring out. And now
I'm very honored that you read my book. I just hope you also bought it.
Yeah.
You don't have to say what you did. You don't have to say what you did. Just advise your viewers to buy multiple copies of it.
Yeah, I will. That's the whole point we're doing this show.
because that way, they may want to read it again.
Yeah,
so have more than one copy. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. That's good publicity, John. Now, tell me, we have a lot of modern scholars who have, views that you don't quite agree with, and you say they may be quite incorrect in presenting this attitude that the Hebrew Bible may be sort of drawing towards its readers in terms of the death of a person of afterlife as that removal of essence from the individual's essence. What do you have to say to that kind of view that they present?
Excuse me. What I would say is that there is an important distinction to be made between what you might call the religion of ancient Israel and the theology of the Hebrew Bible. All kinds of beliefs were held in ancient Israel, I think, about the dead, and maybe their survival, maybe they hover around the graves, and maybe they have some sort of ghost, and etc. Or maybe they come to be transmogrified into the heroes of yesteryear or whatever. I think a lot of that stuff is probably around in ancient Israel. You can find hints of it in the Hebrew Bible. But what the Hebrew Bible tries to insist on, in its various diverse ways, it's because it's a very diverse document, is a theology that doesn't ascribe powers to the dead. It doesn't. There's almost no case of people consulting the dead. The one example is Saul and the witch of Endor, 1 Samuel 28. There's almost nothing else like that, and even that doesn't really work. All he finds out is what he's already been told when she brings up what appears to be the ghost of Samuel. Very little of that in the Hebrew Bible. So I wouldn't deny that such beliefs in souls and essences and ghosts and so forth existed in what you might call the people. But I think the Hebrew Bible wants to focus on this world and on God's promise for this world, and on God's superiority over death itself, which eventuates finally in the notion of the resurrection of the dead. What people often say, this is very commonly said, I think this is relevant to your question, is what about this thing called Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, it's usually written in English, Sheol. Isn't it the belief that when you die in the Hebrew Bible, you go to Sheol? And what is Sheol? It's a miserable, dark, dank, literally God-abandoned netherworld where nobody praises God. I think of the descriptions of Sheol in the Bible as the in terms of someone who, God forbid, is a severe cancer patient, a terminal cancer patient, lying there on his bed in pain, emaciated, unable to eat, difficulty speaking. It's like the next stage beyond that. We might say the next stage beyond that is, God forbid, death. They might say the next stage beyond that is, yes, death, but the person is in that state, maybe a little enhanced in that state, in Sheol. My question is, should we assume everybody goes to Sheol in the Hebrew Bible? Because we do read a number of cases, and not rare, of people who die contented, full of years. We read this about Abraham. We read this about Job. We read this about Moses. In a sense, he has a vision, not of his descendants, which is a key part of this vision, but of the promised land. And then he dies. When people die and are buried with their fathers, to use the biblical idiom, they lie with their fathers, they are buried with their fathers, probably referring to an ancestral tomb and so forth, the ancestral cave, that sort of thing. Are we supposed to believe those people are in Sheol? In other words, are we supposed to believe that the biblical author describes those people as having had a fortunate death? But in fact, what he thinks when he writes this with his fingers crossed behind his back, because he really thinks is they're in this miserable, dark, dank, God-abandoned netherworld. I don't think so. I think there's a kind of duality there in the biblical text. Those who have a fortunate death versus those who have an unfortunate death. Those who live a fulfilled life versus unfulfilled life. The unfulfilled life is a life that ends violently, that ends because of God's punishment, that ends without descendants, that ends without a proper burial. That's an unfulfilled life. And I think people who had that unfulfilled life could go to Sheol in the older biblical notion. The people of Sheol is populated with people who have these unfortunate deaths, indicating their life did not reach fulfillment. But people who died peacefully with the promises of God fulfilled and not in a state of punishment with God, and who see their descendants and have their descendants and are buried peacefully in their familial tomb, I don't think in the Bible they actually think they went to Sheol. I don't see evidence that they went to Sheol. The term Sheol appears some 88 times in the Hebrew Bible, and almost always in very emotional texts, very, very emotional texts where the person is terrified of death. Mostly poetic texts, very common in the book of Psalms. Sometimes you see statements that everybody goes to Sheol when they die. I'm thinking, I have here Psalm 49:11. If you see wise people, you may think wisdom protects them against death, which is something you do sometimes find in the book of Proverbs. Yeah. It says, no, they die. They die along with the fool. The person is not acquired wisdom. The wise people die, and they leave their wealth to other people. That seems to be the inevitability and universality of death. That's Psalm 49:11. But it's interesting, when you go just 5 verses later, you get to Psalm 49:16. But God will redeem me from Sheol. Yeah. And he will take me. And we can ask, what does it mean, God will take me? We don't exactly know, but clearly it stands in opposition to Sheol. So even the psalmist here thinks that the grace of God can make him an exception to the unfulfilled life, the unfortunate death that results in people going to Sheol. I think if you look at that, I'm going on too long in this, but I think if you look at this dichotomy between the fortunate and unfortunate death, and the dichotomy in language that describes those two things, you can see that dichotomy between those resurrected from the dead and have a positive judgment, those not resurrected or resurrected and have a negative judgment, the seed of that is already in those biblical narratives.
Okay, maybe for the benefit of our audience, you know this term Sheol keeps coming up. So I would be right to say this Hebrew term Sheol means one could say view it as this place of darkness or this deep hole type of thing. Is that be correct?
Yeah, sometimes that's correct. I think sometimes it's just used as a term for the grave, but the grave is personification of death. It's thought of as dark, miserable, very unpleasant place. We should all hope we don't end up there. But I don't think in the Hebrew Bible there's a dichotomy of heaven and hell. If you think of Sheol as hell, well, that's not exactly right. Some of the people die through no fault of their own, or there through no fault of their own. They may die childless. They may have lost a child. When Jacob thinks his beloved son Joseph is dead, he thinks he's going down to Sheol, uncomforted. He's living the unfulfilled life. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's sinned, or that he thinks he's sinned. So it's not exactly hell. But the alternative to that, I think, is a life that gracefully comes to an end, the fulfilled life, and the person who sees the descendants is buried in the familial tomb, and the continuity of the generations is underscored. And that's the opposite, I think, to the netherworld of Sheol.
Okay, and John, can God still fulfill His promise to a person, even after they've died, whether they died after they, suffered dearly, and also can God still vindicate this person, even this person who has died through their descendants?
I think there's, in the earlier stages, I think yes. I think in the Hebrew Bible, by and large, there's a notion of a kind of justice that can be worked on through the descendants, just as there can be punishment deferred from one generation to the next. There can also be a vindication from one generation to the next. I think that's a function of that familial concept of identity, that intergenerational concept of identity that I keep harping on. So I think that the answer to that is yes. But within the developed Judaism and Christianity that has this doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, it's more than just descendants. It's the actual person being renewed and miraculously restored in flesh and blood, if you want to use the dichotomy of body and soul, in both body and soul, not just in soul. But in the earlier stage, yes, I think they did see the vindication could come, or punishment. Here's an example I think of. Who was the first actual articulated person we see in the Bible who's a slave? It's Hagar, the Egyptian. And God responds to her pleas in Genesis 16 in ways that seem cruel to us. He says, return to your mistress, namely Sarah, and suffer under her hand. Hitani tachad yadeha. Suffer under her hand. So you might say, well, she goes back. She's given a major consolation prize, which is Ishmael, who becomes a great nation and so forth. But who takes the Israelite Sarah's, what is that? Sarah's son is Isaac, grandson is Jacob, so her great-grandson, Joseph, who takes him to Egypt to be a slave? None other than the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Hagar. And then what does Joseph do? He then enslaves the Egyptians in Genesis 47. But what do the Egyptians do in Exodus 1? They enslave the Israelites. You see, there's a sense in which this is a kind of a karma that works itself out over generations. It's not just limited to the individuals who do the deed, who release the karma. It works itself out over generations in the Hebrew Bible. But by the time I think you get to later forms of Judaism and Christianity and Islam too, there's this notion of the resurrection of the dead. It's not just the descendants of the future generations enacting this old script or correcting this old script. It's also the individuals themselves facing a judgment and vindication.
Okay, that's very interesting, John. I pick up when I read from the Hebrew Bible itself, there are people who are sort of given an exception. People like Enoch, people like who seem not to even taste death. And, you have some who come back to life after they have been dead, such as, the Shunammite boy and also the guy who touches Elisha's bones. What do we say to that? What is going on there when we're looking at those texts?
Very, very, very good question. Those are fascinating texts that you're pointing to. Well, let's take the example of Enoch. Enoch is the seventh patriarch between Adam and Noah, and he doesn't live very long. He only lives 365 years. And that's not very old in those generations between Adam and Enoch. I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind making, one quarter of that. But what it says about Enoch is that Enoch walked with God and he wasn't, kilakach oto Elohim, because God took him. Now, what does it mean? He walked with God. Those 365 years, walked with God and wasn't. It doesn't say he died. It's odd in the sequence. And what does it mean? It says God took him. We really don't know what that means. But there is a general belief, I think, not at all rare in the Hebrew Bible, that God is sovereign over death and that God can bring people up even from Sheol. We see this in Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses. We see this in 1 Samuel 2, the Song of Hannah, that God can send people down to Sheol and can bring them up. He can strike them dead, and he can also heal them. And so it's hard to know what it means in the case of Enoch. Does it mean he never died? That God translated him to some new place? And who knows what that is? We really don't know. In the case of Elijah, he goes off into the sky. Does that mean he didn't die? Jewish tradition generally reads it as he didn't die and is still around, and in the end of time will be a harbinger of good news, a harbinger of the Busarot Tovot, of the good news to the entire world, that redemption has finally happened. But we really don't know what happened with him. And then both, as you point out, both Elijah and Elisha, 1 Kings 17, 2 Kings 4, they do, in parallel texts that seem suspiciously parallel, they do in fact resurrect a boy who's died. And so, but should we assume those boys will never die again? They will never face a second death? I tend to think not. I tend to think they will face a second death. I don't think this is the general resurrection of the dead. They're not putting on the spiritual body, to use Paul's term. They're not having the new refurbished body immune to disease and death. But those texts do demonstrate that there's great confidence that God was more powerful than death. And that death, therefore, is not the last word. There is an ultimate victory of the God of life that goes beyond death.
Okay.
Just point out, can I bring up one other text relevant to that?
You can. Go ahead. Yes.
I always think of Psalm 73 in that connection. This is Psalm 73, 24. You will lead me in your counsel. Okay, this is what the psalmist says to God. And something that's often translated, and with glory or after glory or something, you will take me. This is a great expression of faith and confidence in God's protection on the part of the psalmist in Psalm 73. That's interesting. That's the same verb, you will take me. That's the same verb used of Enoch, that God took him.
Yeah.
The person has some confidence. Does that mean he will escape death? Does it mean that there'll be something after death? It's very hard to know. But what I think it's very clear is they didn't believe that their hope in God simply ended at the grave. God was more powerful than death. That's what they thought. And therefore, I don't think it surprised them that there were some individuals whom he took before they died, or somehow whom he rescued from death.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, John. The kind of picture that you sort of bringing across from this conversation that we're having. But some may have asked that there are other scholars out there who sort of promulgate that this idea of the resurrection maybe would have come under the influence of the Hashmoneans or under the Persian influence, and they view this as more of a response to the death of the righteous martyrs during the Antiochus sort of persecutions. Is your view sort of in line with this ideology?
No, basically my view, it really is not in line with that. I don't deny that the death of the martyrs who were put to death because they were faithful may have provoked some sort of crisis in the minds of some. But the notion that the innocent die and that there is a scandal, a theological scandal in the death of the innocent and the pure, and that's been around for a long time in ancient Israel. And traditionally, it was solved or addressed, I think, through the notion of this intergenerational responsibility and God's future action, maybe action against the descendants of the wrongdoer or against the nation that did the wrongdoing. So why the change? It's not a new idea. I mean, Cain kills Abel, right? And Abel's innocent. Abel finds favor with God and therefore is put to death. I mean, this is not a new situation that these martyrs were facing. I think that the logic of that position is a little simplistic. I think the belief in the resurrection of the dead grew up slowly over the centuries through a number of the convergence of a number of different factors that we've been talking about, and a major one I haven't stressed enough here is this proto-apocalyptic or apocalyptic expectation you see in chapters in Isaiah 40 through 66, especially, of God intervening to heal nature, to heal creation, to produce a new heaven, a new earth, that is to say, to produce a better world than we now live in, as part of the vision of the restored Jerusalem and the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and the reconstruction of the temple and the fulfillment of the promises to David, et cetera, et cetera. That notion of, if you have, as you do in those later chapters of Isaiah, and a vision of God healing the blind so they can see and healing the deaf so they can sing, then is there any reason he can't heal the dead so they live? I think, in fact, this vision of a radical inversion of things that I'm calling apocalyptic eschatology, I really think that's the main source of the origin for the resurrection of the dead in ancient Judaism, and then carrying over into Christianity and eventually into Islam. I think that's really the source of it. I'm not saying that there wasn't a particularly acute need for it at the time of the Antiochian persecutions in the 160s BCE, but I don't really think that's the source of it. People often say, well, isn't it borrowed from Zoroastrianism? You mentioned Persian tradition. Zoroastrianism with notions like this. Well, Zoroastrians, as I understand it, exposed the dead, hilltops or whatever, had birds pecking at the dead or whatever it was, didn't pollute the earth by burying the dead. The Israelites buried the dead. The dust went back to the dust from which it came. And the vision you have in Ezekiel 37 is Israel coming up out of their graves. I'm not saying Zoroastrianism might not have been a catalyst in the general cultural situation, but I don't think it's a direct borrowing. Generally, I don't like explanations of developments that see they have one source, one logical source, that's it. I think a lot of things come together in culture. Many factors converge to produce novelty in culture.
Yeah, I think it's very crucial what you mentioned, that as things evolve over time and we kind of sort of borrow from each other to formulate something that is totally new altogether. And now, in your view, John, I know in the pre-exilic text we don't have explicit mentions of the resurrection itself. And what evidence can you sort of demonstrate to our audience in terms of these texts which may have contributed towards this kind of belief in of the resurrection in pre-exilic text?
Well, I don't think the resurrection, meaning a general resurrection of the dead, what the rabbis call Tchiat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, I think Christians call it the general resurrection. I don't think you really have that affirmed in pre-exilic Israelite texts taken at their plain sense, reading. The belief that God is stronger than death and can bring people up from Sheol, as I mentioned, that you can find in hymnic texts, hymns like Deuteronomy 32 or 1 Samuel 2, Song of Moses, Song of Hannah. You can find statements like that. You can find these individual cases, such as you've been bringing up, of individuals who come back from the dead. They touch the bones of a holy man and they're resurrected, or the holy man himself resurrects the boys that have died, in those texts we've already mentioned. So all these things are kind of seeds or factors that come together in the resurrection of the dead, plus the notion of birth or new life as the antidote to and the correction to the answer to death. All that, I think, feeds into this, but I don't actually think you see the resurrection of the dead as a formulated doctrine in pre-exilic Israel, which is one reason why it was so controversial when it comes to be taken as a doctrine in Second Temple times, why you have Pharisees in favor of it and Sadducees against it, right? It was controversial because it involved certain biblical interpretation that not everybody accepted, and it wasn't in accordance with the plain sense of the verse, but it was in the rabbinic mind vindicated through the exegesis the rabbis themselves did with those verses. Okay.
You seem to be kind of subtle in your argumentation in your book, regarding modern scholars or Western scholars, I would call them, in terms of how they kind of oversimplify the whole notion of the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, and you also knock against this historically based reductionism that sort of appears, and you also touch on the notions of terms like revolutionary and evolutionary, and what is the significance of you taking that direction in terms of making sure that people understand what these terms would mean, and the significance thereof in terms of understanding what these terms actually mean?
That's a very big question, very important big question. Historians, and to some degree I'm an historian, we like to craft a narrative that makes sense, and it's gripping and ideally can be understood by our audiences, although academics increasingly write in such a way that only other academics can understand it. But I think reality is much more complicated than that, especially textual reality, where so much of the tradition comes from the reading of previous texts, the rereading of previous texts, and the exegesis of previous text and the bringing together of disparate texts so as to make a new statement that neither text in and of itself makes, such as happens in the genre the rabbis call midrash. The rabbis call midrash. If you get into that degree of detail, you see that these simple notions, you have this stage followed by that stage, and you have this event that caused that to happen. Real life, I think, is more complex than that. It's more multifarious, multifactorial, whatever term you want to use than that. That's the short answer. I guess the longer answer, I would focus more on the this notion of the ambiguity of texts and the way in which, in the textual reasoning of ancient Israelite and Jewish sources, that is not like the textual reasoning of moderns looking at only the plain sense, or historically informed moderns putting these texts into their historical context only. It's more like the interpretation of poetry or the generation of new poems that allude to and make use of previous poems. And when you put it in that light, you see continuities that the standard historical evolutionary narrative often misses.
Okay, I think, John, as our last question, we see this evolution of this notion of resurrection that finds itself in the New Testament itself. And would you say by the time this ideology of, this idea of the resurrection itself, by the time it hits the New Testament era, and the formulation of some of the books of the New Testament, or even some of the epistles, is it now at a very solid stage, or is it still evolving at that time?
Oh, I would say it's still evolving. I think it's evolving even within the New Testament as to when this will happen. And certainly early Christianity, there's a lot of dispute about exactly what it means to say Jesus rose from the dead, and how bodily was it, and he only appeared to rise from the dead. So even within early Christian tradition, there's a great deal of controversy. And certainly within Judaism, as I say, there was the position that historians generally ascribe to the Pharisees in favor of a doctrine of resurrection of the dead, and a position ascribed to the Sadducees that was opposed to the belief in the resurrection of the dead. I mean, the rabbis would not read out of the community, these Talmudic rabbis that I mentioned, would not read out of the community those who denied the resurrection of the dead, or in one formulation, there's only one formulation, denied that the resurrection of the dead was in the Torah. They wouldn't do that if there weren't a lot of opposition, a lot of controversy about this. So I think there's controversy about this within Judaism, certainly in the first century, and within Christianity for hundreds of years afterwards. Exactly what is being affirmed, and all the details, and exactly what happened, and so forth. And these remain controversial points. So I would not say it's settled doctrine. It's an affirmation that the rabbinic tradition, and what you might call the Orthodox Christian tradition, Orthodox with a small O Christian tradition, made and continues to make to this day, makes it liturgically, makes it as a key hope and expectation. But it's never been without its detractors and its doubters.
Okay. I think, John, I've certainly enjoyed, having this conversation with you, and I hope our listeners have also enjoyed these fascinating insights that you sort of bring out in your book. And I hope it's a step in the right direction for them to sort of get to understand these things. And I think, they can learn from what you have done over the years. And I appreciate you having accepted the time to come out and have a chat with us. Thank you very much. And
well, thank you very much for the invitation and for your very learned and stimulating questions and your careful reading of my book.
Thank you. Before I let you go, John, I know scholars in the background tend to be doing stuff that we don't know of, and would you sort of tell my audience where to sort of find your stuff, your books, and other resources that you may be working on currently?
Well, currently I'm very slowly writing a book on the Sabbath. Right. I joke that I now am working on the Sabbath, and it's making slow progress. God willing, I'll even scribble some things this afternoon, but that's my current project. My last one was a book called The Love of God, and It deals with the love of God in the Hebrew Bible, especially in Deuteronomic tradition, and in the prophetic image of the marriage of God and Israel, and how that feeds into the rabbinic reading of the Song of Songs as the love song of God and the Jewish people, parallel with Christian readings emerge at the same time of the love song of Christ and His church and so forth. That's the sort of thing I've been working on in recent years.
All right. Thank you, John. It has been good. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight. And I hope our audience back home have enjoyed this content. If you've liked it, you can subscribe to our channel so that you get these feeds on how we tackle these tough conversations with different scholars from around the world. And until we see you next time, keep tuning in. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.